Welcome to Battleground, where we break down the latest news and biggest issues driving voters in the 7 swing states that will decide this election. First up, new polls suggest a Sunbelt shift towards Kamala Harris, why both campaigns are doubling down on their get-out-the-vote efforts in Nevada and Arizona. Then, how Jewish voters in many of our swing states could tip this election one way or the other, and what both campaigns are doing to shore up a critical voting bloc. Plus, as we kick off this Labor Day weekend, a look at where this race stands in all 7 of our swing states. I'm Cupp, and with 66 days until the election, this is Battleground.
I will tell you, first and foremost, one of my highest priorities is to do what we can to support and strengthen the middle class. When I look at the aspirations, the goals, the ambitions of the American people, I think that people are ready for a new way forward.
And what we're going to do is, for people that are using IVF, which is fertilization, the government is going to pay for it, or we're going to get or mandate your insurance company to pay for it, which is going to be great. We're going to do that.
Kamala Harris and Donald Trump last night making their pitch to swing state voters. For the vice president, it was her first sit-down interview since becoming the Democratic nominee, while Donald Trump was in Battleground, Wisconsin, holding a televised town hall in La Crosse. And some news from our 2 Sunbelt swing states, Arizona and Nevada. New polls show Kamala Harris making up significant ground out west and even opening up a slight lead. But it's worth noting her lead is very much within the margin of error. For more on the latest in Nevada, I'm pleased to be joined by Gabby Birnbaum from the Nevada Independent. Gabby, good to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, let's start with that latest polling out west. Just how tight is the race there?
Yeah, the race is pretty much what you'd expect for a swing state. It's a toss-up. When Joe Biden was the candidate, I think you saw polls consistently showing Trump up 5-6 points, even double digits, to the point that the Trump campaign had sort of moved Nevada into its win column. They weren't thinking of it necessarily as a toss-up. Just in the last month, we've seen polls swing Harris's direction. Nate Silver's polling model shows that Kamala Harris has gained about 6 points from where Biden was. And so now you're seeing Harris up 1-2. Basically a toss-up, and what you'd expect from a state like Nevada that's always close.
Gaining 6 points, that's a big deal. We've heard from reporters there that polling in Nevada can be very tricky in trying to read the tea leaves of this race. Why is that?
Yeah, for a few reasons, Nevada is always really difficult to poll. Number one, it's a super transient state. So there's a lot of voters who come in from California, from other Western states, people leave. I often use the Senate race as an example of this. So Jackie Rosen is right up for re-election. The electorate that she's talking to in 2024 is about 30% different from the people who voted for her in 2018. So that's just an example of how much things change. Yeah. And then number two, people in Nevada, right, this is Las Vegas. They work overnight, they work weird hours. They can be really difficult to reach and to poll. And so for those reasons, it can be really difficult to get an accurate read on where things stand in Nevada.
Yeah, good insight. Thank you. We learned this week that RFK Jr. will not appear on the ballot in Nevada. This, of course, after he dropped out of the race and endorsed Donald Trump. What are you seeing in terms of how RFK voters will break there?
Yeah, it's tough to know exactly, right? A lot of times people who are interested in third-party candidates are frustrated, right, with the two-party system. A lot of them can be disengaged and disaffected voters. What we have seen is that if you look at polling averages, if you take RFK out, polls move about 1 point in Harris's direction, so a pretty negligible effect. The Trump campaign disagrees. They've put out their own polling showing that about 2/3 of Kennedy voters would break for Trump. I think, what my conclusion is, no one exactly knows how these voters are going to break, and their numbers were dwindling anyway. So it'll be interesting to see as we move into the fall if either campaign gains ground.
Yeah. And finally, Gabby, you and your colleagues at The Independent have been reporting on the Trump campaign ramping up their infrastructure in Nevada. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, like I mentioned, because the Trump campaign hadn't necessarily thought of Nevada as a battleground, they're a bit on the back foot now with their infrastructure. And so Democrats, the Reid machine, they've always been known for this really strong coordinated campaign and political machine. They have 14 campaign offices in Nevada. Trump now has 5. So that's been an expansion over the past months, but still significantly lagging Democrats. They are starting to staff up. What I hear from them, and this is true of other swing states, I'm sure you'll hear this from other reporters, they're targeting low propensity voters. So they feel like it's not necessarily about quantity of staff or infrastructure, it's about quality, knocking on the right doors instead of knocking on all doors. And so we'll see if that pays off for them. Yeah. But they're about targeting people who they think will vote Republican. They just don't often vote.
Interesting. And yeah, we'll be tracking that Harry Reid machine, see if it still is robust as it once was. Gabby Birnbaum from the Nevada Independent. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Up next, why both campaigns are targeting Jewish voters in many of our swing states. Battleground, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Battleground. Jewish voters may make up a small portion of the electorate in many of our swing states, but if this election goes the way the last one did, coming down to just a few thousand votes in some cases, those voters could still be significant. Take a look. These numbers speak for themselves. 4 of our swing states have over 100,000 Jewish residents: Pennsylvania, Arizona, Michigan, and Georgia, with Pennsylvania by far having the most at over 400,000. For a closer look at why Jewish voters are so important in this election, I'm pleased to be joined by Jonathan Weisman, who covers politics for the New York Times. Jonathan, good to have you here.
Happy to be here.
Okay, let's start right here in Pennsylvania, where I am, because as we just mentioned, the state is home to over 400,000 Jewish residents. We know they're not a monolith, and most presumably are worried about the same things every voter is: the economy, immigration, women's rights. But how can Trump and Harris appeal to these voters?
Well, you're absolutely right. Jewish voters are really not. And in fact, Trump personally seems to think that all Jewish voters think about is Israel.
Right.
His appeal to Jewish voters has always been, I am the best candidate for Israel. I am the guy who will always do what the Israeli government wants. And in fact, that's not what most Jewish American voters want. Jewish Americans tend to be Democrats. They tend to be more liberal. About 75%, 74% of Jewish voters have consistently voted with the Democrats. So I kind of think that Trump's appeal here is a little misguided, and he keeps trying it all the time. But with the war in Gaza and the attacks of October 7th on Israelis on Israeli soil, I think there's a little more sensitivity this year, especially with a rise of anti-Semitism that we've seen on the left. And so a lot of Jewish voters are looking for signals from Kamala Harris and the Harris campaign that the Harris campaign is sensitive to Jewish concerns and sensitive to the rise of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Trump thinks that he's in good position here because he feels like the rise of anti-Semitism has all been on the left, and that all he needs to do is reassure Jewish voters that he stands with Israel. It's a little more complicated than that.
Yeah, and I want to talk to you about how complicated the Gaza issue is in a sec. But staying here in Pennsylvania, Governor Josh Shapiro, who's not only Jewish but very popular here in the state, he was on the short list to be Kamala Harris's running mate, as you know. Had he been chosen as the VP, do you think that would have moved the needle significantly in Pennsylvania with Jewish voters?
It's tough to say because I think that it would have helped with Jewish voters in Pennsylvania, but it probably would have hurt with Arab American voters in Michigan. So, these are 2 vital states. You gain in one, you lose in another. And I think that possibly Shapiro was seen as risky in that sense. And obviously Kamala Harris went a different direction.
Yeah, good point. And finally, Jonathan, in states like Florida, which have significant Jewish populations, Trump's only improved his standing. In 2016, he won 24% of the Jewish vote there. And in 2020, he won 41%. Is this a constituency Republicans could flip?
I think that in Florida and in other, it's interesting because there's been a migration of Jewish voters from New York and New Jersey, which always had the largest population, down to the South. Just like, there's been a migration from the Northeast to the South all over from all sorts of populations. Yeah. And those Jews that have moved from the Northeast have tended to sorted themselves out. More conservative Jewish voters in the Northeast have gone to Florida and South Carolina. More liberal Jewish voters have ended up in Georgia, some in North Carolina too. Yeah. So there has been a sorting in there. And I do think that those numbers from Florida are significant.
Really interesting. Jonathan Weisman with the New York Times. Thanks so much for breaking all of that down for us.
Thank you, Essie.
For more on all of this, visit us at battlegroundnews.com or click on the QR code right here. You can sign up for our newsletter, download our interactive swing state map, and find our social media links. And if you miss an episode, that's okay. You can catch up on YouTube or through our podcast. Up next, a look at why Georgia and Wisconsin have been front and center in the race this week. Battleground will be right back.
How do I feel about it?
Yeah, Trump or Kamala?
Trump or who?
I'm glad that Kamala stepped in so we can have like somebody younger and it's not just two old white men fighting for the position. She kind of gave me a little bit more hope.
He's in it for a get back what happened to him. Harris, she seems genuine.
Right now there's just a question mark, about what she has to offer. Whereas Trump, I think he's put it out there what his policies are.
Welcome back to Battleground. Voters in Georgia weighing in on this race as Kamala Harris and Tim Walz wrapped up their two-day swing through the state. Last night also saw dueling primetime TV events for both campaigns, with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz on CNN. Notably, it was her first sit-down interview of any kind since becoming the official Democratic nominee, and Donald Trump in La Crosse, Wisconsin, for a town hall in an area of the state Republicans hope remains red. For more on a very busy week, I'm pleased to be joined once again on this Friday by our friend Chris Cillizza, author of the So What Substack. Chris, good to see you.
Hey, Essie.
Okay, let's start in Georgia because Kamala Harris and Tim Walz went to parts of the state that Democrats sometimes ignore. To you, does that tell you they're worried about Georgia or they're confident about their standing there?
I guess if I had to choose between those two, I'd say confident. But what I would really say is smart, in that I think they understand that if they're going to win Georgia, it's going to be by a hair, right? Kamala Harris and Tim Walz aren't winning Georgia 55-45.
Right.
So I think what they're doing is saying, okay, we know we're going to get a lot of vote out of Atlanta, okay? But we also need to not lose as bad. They're not going to win a lot of the places they're going, but not lose as bad in those places. Like rather than 80-20, maybe it's 65-35 or even 70-30, because they just need handfuls of votes from around those more rural and suburban places to add to that big chunk they're going to get in Atlanta. So I think it is smart and a recognition that if they win, maybe we're talking about 10,000, 20,000 vote margin.
Yes. And while they were there, Chris, they sat down with CNN for what was their first interview as the Democratic ticket. Here in Pennsylvania, where I am, fracking is a big issue. How do you think Kamala Harris's explanation of her changing position on fracking went over with Pennsylvania voters?
I mean, I didn't think the explanation was great. I thought she was trying to split hairs a little bit. She was saying, well, in 2019, I was in favor of banning fracking, but by 2020, I wasn't really, and I've been consistent for the last 4 years. So I didn't think that answer was great. Now, I will say that what the campaign will point to is she said, I will not ban fracking, right? So that they're going to say, look, we can debate what she said 5 years ago. I personally think her explanation of some of her flip-flops have not been terrific, but they'll say it's in the past. Voters care about the future, and she has said on the record, I will not ban fracking. So whatever she said before, if she gets to be president, that's what she's going to do, and that's what they're going to say matters.
And if you're a voter whose job depends on fracking, maybe that's the most important thing you heard.
Absolutely. And again, like, I recognize my own sort of like journalistic biases here. I'm always like, but that's not what you used to say.
Right.
The average voter, I think, says like, okay, if this person gets elected president, what are they going to do? What have they said? What have they pledged they will do? And it's great if they have been consistent over a long period of time, but ultimately I think they care. Where are they now? Right. Not where they have been.
Yeah, I think you're right. So for his part, Donald Trump was in western Wisconsin doing a town hall last night. The big news out of that event was Trump announcing he wants to make the government or insurance companies pay for IVF treatments. Does that help alleviate concerns about his women's reproductive rights positions among women in swing states?
Yeah, so he had a day yesterday. So he said that he thought the 6-week abortion ban that's going to be on the ballot in Florida was too short. Then the campaign said, well, that doesn't mean he'll vote against it.
Right.
I don't totally get that, but okay. And then in Wisconsin, as you point out, Essie, he talked about IVF. Now, the first thing I mentioned, the 6-week ban, was more off the cuff. The IVF thing was more intentional.
Yeah.
I think the Trump campaign, because they look at polling data, are aware that they have an issue, as all Republicans do, candidly, on the abortion issue, and Donald Trump in particular, because he put Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett on the court.
Yeah.
And that was the deciding vote to overturn Roe v. Wade. So I think he is trying to do things to make clear that he is going to take a lot of steps that women are going to be supportive of. I still think it's a problem because I think ultimately it's like, if Donald Trump wasn't president, Roe v. Wade would almost certainly still be the law of the land. You know, if Hillary Clinton had won in 2016. And I think that's just a thing that's sort of a fundamental big takeaway.
Yeah.
I think he can try to eat away at it. I don't know that it'll work.
Yeah. Let's head to the Sunbelt because polling out this weekend suggests Kamala Harris is pulling ahead in Arizona and Nevada. Now, Trump lost Nevada twice, but he won Arizona in 2016. How do you read the latest polling?
So my view is if we're thinking of, let's think of it, because I think a lot of people like us do, let's think of Nevada and Arizona. They're obviously not the same state, but let's think of them as a pair. For me, Nevada is actually harder for Kamala Harris than Arizona. And the reason for that is because while a lot of the economy has recovered post-COVID, one thing that hasn't is the hospitality and tourism industry as much. And obviously Nevada's economy is very dependent on that, right? So I'm a little bit more skeptical of the polling in Nevada right now because I just think it's a harder hold for her. But look, I think when you take it broadly, I thought with Joe Biden as the nominee, you were talking really about 3 battleground states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania.
Yep.
Now we're talking about, now we could have talked about other ones, but it was a stretch. Now we're legitimately talking about 7.
That's right.
I think North Carolina now belongs in there, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. And I would not have put those 4 in there 8 weeks ago if we were talking about it. So to me, the key is not that she's ahead, that she's put them into real play in a way that Biden wasn't going to.
Yep. And your point about Nevada is so great because Nevada is notoriously difficult to poll. So we'll have to keep checking back in with Nevada over the next few weeks. Chris, Cillizza, great stuff as always. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Essie. See ya.
Up next, we head to all 7 swing states to gauge the state of the race on this Labor Day weekend. Battleground will be right back. Welcome back to Battleground. Finally tonight, a quick look at the state of the race in all 7 of our swing states. Starting right here in Pennsylvania with Sheba Russell from Fox 29 Philadelphia. Sheba.
Hi there, Essie. Kamala Harris is leading Donald Trump by 0.8% in Pennsylvania. This is an average of the polls from the end of July through yesterday and clearly within the margin of error. So this race is still super tight. Both campaigns have been making rural PA a priority when it comes to campaign stops. Trump, President Biden and Harris together spending a part of their Labor Day weekend rallying voters in the western part of the state.
Thanks, Sheba. To North Carolina now, and Danielle Battaglia with the News and Observer. Danielle.
And Democrats really focused in on the Harris campaign and winning North Carolina throughout the last 15 months. That seems to have paid off for them because both the Cook Political Report and the University of Virginia's Center for Politics has moved North Carolina from a state that leans Republican to one that is a toss-up. And that has put pressure on the Trump campaign to start leaning back into North Carolina and bring their campaign back to the state.
Thanks, Danielle. To Wisconsin and Dan Hagan with Newswatch 12 in Rhinelander. Dan.
Essie, Wisconsin is a popular place if you're a presidential or vice presidential candidate. J.D. Vance has been here 4 times since the RNC, and pretty much same goes for Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, and Donald Trump. Expect to see a lot more visits from them in the coming months. And one thing of note, RFK Jr. asked to be taken off the Wisconsin ballot, but he will remain on it.
Thank you, Dan. Down to Georgia and Melissa Cruz with USA Today. Melissa.
So what we're seeing in Georgia right now is that the race is really as close as it's been all election season. The latest polls show that former President Trump is ahead of Vice President Harris, but just by 0.6 percentage points.
Okay, to Michigan and Clara Hendrickson with the Detroit Free Press. Clara.
The latest polling averages show Harris 2 or 3 percentage points above Trump in Michigan.
Thanks, Clara. We head to Nevada and Ricardo Torres Cortez with the Las Vegas Review-Journal.
Polls of Nevada voters cited by The Hill show the race neck and neck. Both candidates have since returned to Las Vegas after President Joe Biden dropped out of the race and after the attempted assassination on former President Trump.
Thanks, Ricardo. And finally in Arizona with Samara Klar from the University of Arizona. Samara.
In Arizona, the polls are so razor thin right now. I mean, there's really nobody that is showing outside of the margin of error. We're seeing Trump up by a couple percentage points in some polls, Harris up by a couple percentage points in another. The trend has been in Harris's favor, but at this point, it's really just too close to call.
Thanks. That's it for now. I'm Essie Cupp. Have a great Labor Day weekend. See you next time here on Battleground.